here. I look forward to talking, to hearing your questions and providing feedback. A few things to get out of the way. I'm a moral philosopher. I work so far from the public sector. I give this talk to lots of audiences, never to philosophers. So I'm going to be talking about this from a totally different area, but hopefully the lessons and the things I'm going to say touch on and are applicable to you. And I'm happy to work with you and talk with you about how that might be so. I'd like to start by what I want to do today is motivate the need for what I'm going to call an ethics ecosystem for AI and big data, and talk about what an ethics ecosystem partly consists in. And then I'm going to talk through an example of how to try to contribute to building it or per modeling such an ecosystem. I'm going to do this by talking across a bunch of different examples. None of them are particularly public sector examples, although one of them very closely touches on stuff at the intersection of the public sector. But really, it's to motivate why we keep making mistakes in this area and what a real solution is going to have to look like, and what it means for individual practitioners that are interacting with AI that they have to be on the lookout for as they try to navigate the ethical challenges raised by these technologies until we get to something like an ecosystem. I'm going to warn you, I'm going to do something that makes me as a philosopher very uncomfortable, and that's that I'm going to say a bunch of things that I will not defend in excruciating, painful detail. It goes against my very nature. So I'm going to give some arguments, but not make them in much detail. So if you want to follow up anything, please, the most comfortable a philosopher is when someone's disagreeing with them in the Q&A. Okay, so let me start with this, talking about what it is that we want. AI holds incredible promise, and I think people genuinely want to realize that promise ethically. So what we want, I think, is to realize the promise of AI while mitigating against ethical pitfalls and wrongdoing. But what we have is not that. We have an unstructured mess of concepts. If you work in this space at all and try to do some research on it, you'll find things like responsible AI, trustworthy AI, fair AI. You'll see many commitments to broad principles like fairness, transparency, privacy, but few concrete ways to realize those in any part of practice. And then, of course, we have lots of examples of unethicality. I could have easily have replaced this slide instead of this teetering mess of concepts with an image representing that. I could have easily have put from the past 6 weeks just articles where companies using AI have sort of made a moral misstep. Now, why is that? Why is it that despite the fact that most actors, I think, are good and genuinely want to realize the promise, why do we keep tripping over ourselves? Why do we keep making these mistakes? And I think the answer to that, as I'm going to try to motivate, is that we lack what I'm going to call an ethics ecosystem. And we need to aim to cultivate that rather than trying to address issues piecemeal on a case-by-case basis or with a single set of principles that sort of we turn the cranks on and get the right answers. Okay. So what I'm going to do is talk through a variety of challenges that we face. And it's not just companies or for-profit companies that keep making these mistakes, or that's not that they don't care about ethics. I think the problems are systematic and they're not associated with bad actors. And so to convince us, I want to talk about 3 kinds of recurring mistakes that I see in the space, or issues that plague the research to application through practitioners' pipeline for AI applications. So the first is at various levels of decision-making, from individuals and organizations to leadership to governance spaces, we lack concrete operationalized guidance or evaluation tools. And because of that, we have tended to grab onto existing tools from other contexts and misapply them. And the example I'm going to give to showcase this is privacy and informed consent. We'll get into details in a bit. Second, where there has been genuine movement to develop actionable guidance or context-sensitive tools and approaches for AI specifically, the recommendations are often very poor. And this is for a couple reasons. One, many of those with the expertise in ethics, policymaking, things like that, people from my discipline, they fail to appreciate how ethical frameworks and tools interact with the technologies that they hope to provide guidance for. So they don't know enough about how AI works to realize how they need to adapt their toolkits to solve these problems. And I'm actually going to give 2 examples in this space. One is going to be autonomous vehicles, just because it's, until recently, it was the most widely known example of AI ethics. Now the other example I use is large language models, and we'll talk about that too. And then the third kind of issue, or it's related to the second one, is that there are many people interested in solving these problems, and they have lots of technical proficiency. They understand the technical details of these systems, but they don't understand ethics or policymaking or regulation or related disciplines. And so they don't really know how to move from value commitments to technological solutions. And so as it happens, they have their technical expertise, they churn out technical solutions, but they miss the ethical mark. And the example I'm going to give of that is something you may be familiar with, which is issues of algorithmic fairness and a little bit opacity. So I'll talk briefly about some examples of these to do the work of motivating what I'm claiming is the need for an ethics ecosystem. Okay, so let's start with the rush to find some off-the-shelf solutions. So the idea is that we have these problems, but they're not totally new problems. We know that AI raises challenges of privacy and fairness and all these things, but we know that other contexts have these kinds of problems. So what we do is we rush over and we grab a tool that was built for those contexts and we apply it, and it turns out not to be very good. This happens because the tools are built for specific contexts to realize foundational values. So in another area, like say bioethics, we didn't just start by saying, hey, let's use informed consent and let's anonymize personalized data. What we did is we got a bunch of people together and they settled on what are the core foundational values that we should care about. So for example, respect for persons. And then they asked, well, what does it mean in the context of clinical care or in the context of human subjects research or in the context, this is for human subject research, but we have a similar thing for animal subject research. What does it mean to show respect for persons? Well, we settled on the idea that we should try to promote and protect their autonomy. And then we asked, okay, what's a concrete tool we can use to make sure we're doing that? And we came up with a couple: informed consent and anonymization. So informed consent and anonymization are not foundational values. They're just tools. But in the context of clinical care and human subjects research, they do a pretty good job of realizing those foundational values via those intermediary norms. Okay. Now, if we look at how these tools have been deployed and adapted for big data analytics and other contexts and divorce them from the systems in which they're embedded, in that where they do help realize values, we can start to see a disconnect. So in the context of big data analytics, we see an adaptation of informed consent to what we call notice and consent. So informed consent, if you're not familiar with this, when you want to propose a piece of clinical research or human subjects research, you write out a protocol for what you're going to do, how you're going to interact with your subjects. You then you tell the IRB, an oversight board that's actually going to look at your consent procedures, exactly what you're going to tell your participants. And then you have duties to ensure that you're informing your participants of what's going to happen to them, to disclose certain information, to make sure you're avoiding coercion. And so not only are you designing it to make sure you get informed consent, but there's an oversight board that's making sure you're doing a good job of that. If we transition to notice and consent, and what I mean by that is think about any time you go to a website and you're confronted with a chance to say agree or disagree, or you download a piece of software and a screen of text pops up, and at the bottom you click I agree. Most of you don't read those. In fact, I think there's some interesting research that shows if you tried to read all the license agreements or the notice and consent agreements for all the software on your computer, you would do nothing but read end user license agreements. But if you look at the language, if you actually do take some time to read those, you'll see that they're not oriented towards making sure you're well informed about what the software is doing. Instead, it's a block of legalese. It's really oriented towards covering the company's ass, not towards disclosing information. It is disclosed. It's disclosing lots of things, but not in a way that helps you understand them. And so there's a certain sense in which we took this tool from bioethics and we applied it in this new context in the hope of showing respect for persons, but it fails because we've totally transformed the tool. Now, even if you fixed notice and consent, even if you tried really hard, which would be hard given the scale at which you're using the software, to like actually provide informedness, it's not clear that the tool would be any better. And that's for this reason. In the context of AI and big data analytics, my getting consent from some individuals allows me to make inferences about other individuals that have not consented. And so it's unlike clinical care. I mean, this happens sometimes in clinical research when we do genomics research and it requires special consideration. But for the most part, when you consent to be a part of my research protocol, you're not making it possible for me to make inferences, invasive inferences about other people that haven't consented. But big data analytics is all about getting information from some parties to make inferences about others. We can tell the same kind of story about anonymization. In the case of bioethics, not giving access to people's social security number, birth date, blah, 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 can protect them from invasive treatment. It can make sure that they're not, we don't know who they are, and so we can't do certain things to them. But anonymization of those characteristics in the context of big data analytics is basically useless. Facebook, Meta, these companies do not need to know your birth date or social security number to learn a lot about you. The data that seems like it's sort of not pertinent in clinical contexts becomes extremely relevant in the context of big data analytics. So these practical tools outside of their existing ecosystem or existing frameworks actually don't serve the values that we think they do in those other ecosystems. So that's one kind of problem that I see come up a lot. We grab whatever tools are there because rightfully we're worried about protecting certain values, but because those tools were not crafted to preserve those values in a particular context, we just go about mucking things up. Sometimes it looks like ethics washing, like we seem like we have a thing where we're protecting research participants or we're protecting individuals, but we're in fact not. Okay. So deploying ethics tools built for other purposes is just one issue that plagues our goal of realizing the promise of AI or the potential of AI. But the attempt to craft new tools for the context have also not been so great. So this is the part of the talk where I crap on philosophers, like it's partly our fault. I really genuinely believe philosophers, if they could overcome certain problems, could really contribute a lot to the debates about how to craft good, useful regulation, governance, and tools for managing the ethical issues associated with AI. But we keep messing up because philosophers especially, but other people as well, don't really understand these technologies. So we keep coming up and saying, like, here's what you should do, but we don't see how the technologies change what we should do. So I'm going to give two examples of a sort of deep misunderstanding of the technology that results in misguided advice. The first one is the case of trolley case and autonomous vehicles. I'm going to avoid a lot of the technical details. I've written a lot about this, but I'll just give you sort of a mini version of this. And the mini version is this. I don't know, maybe you've seen popular media articles, or maybe you've seen some of the sort of coverage of this idea of autonomous vehicle ethics. This is a screenshot of a website called moralmachine.org, which is a tool that came out of MIT when people were debating what autonomous vehicles should do when they're in a crash scenario. So a crash scenario is when an autonomous vehicle is going to crash. It's going to harm someone. How should we think about how to divide up those harms? So Moral Machine released this project. Half of the Moral Machine team, I'm not numerically, but some subset of the Moral Machine team just released this as a tool to figure out what people's general opinions were about how to solve these issues. They didn't think you should actually use it to program autonomous vehicles. But some subset of the team really thought they should use this data, which is millions and millions of user inputs, to figure out how we should program cars to behave in accident scenarios. There was lots of popular media coverage of this. And when people ask me about AI ethics, until large language models blew up, this is what they asked me about. This is what they knew about AI ethics. But there's a sort of deep misunderstanding of the technology that comes with thinking that we should be thinking about programming cars for how they should respond in these edge case scenarios. And it's not because we shouldn't think about edge cases. It's important to think about edge cases. The problem is that the way you build these cars is using AI. And promissory note, that means that how you train it to act in any given scenario, like everyday driving scenarios, is not unrelated from how you program it to act in these scenarios. So with AI, we don't just say like, hey, when you're in a crash, do X, Y, or Z, but when you're in a normal stop sign, do A, B, and C. Instead, because of the way these things are trained, training it to be really good at stopping at stop signs might make it worse at doing things in accident scenarios. So these things are not to be treated independently. And the standard way that philosophers and most of the public thinks about programming is that we control individual scenarios. But once you get into the realm of machine learning, that's not what's going on. And once you understand that, you have to offer very different advice for how you should program these cars. You have to think much more holistically about how you build the training regimes governing the driving behavior of these vehicles. I'm happy to get into the details of that. It's a fascinating subject for me. I didn't know that it would be for you, so I cut out some slides here to instead talk about this case. Maybe you saw this in the news, but a lawyer went to court with a ChatGPT generated brief. And the brief was very well written in some sense. It looked like a document of legalese. It was turned over to the judge, but it had what are typically now known as hallucinations. A hallucination is what a large language model does is it spits out text, the standard for which is, will it read like decent human text to a human being? Not are the things I'm saying true? And so some of the case law cited in the brief was totally hallucinated. It was made up. The citations just didn't exist. Of course, The lawyer didn't know this because he didn't understand exactly how ChatGPT generated the text. He assumed, not unreasonably, that like when you do a Google search, you're going to get things that have in some sense been vetted, like top Google search results for specific citations are typically accurate. But the judge then like looked at it and went to look at the case law, could not find the relevant case law. Turns out, then they asked the lawyer said, oh, I don't know, I got this from ChatGPT, and then got fined for it. This is a case where our failure to understand how the technologies work just results in us using it in poor ways. But you see the same thing in people's recommendations or worries about the ethical issues associated with things like large language models. I've seen philosophers worried that these things are slowly going to take over our governance, or someone's going to use it to hack the Pentagon. And it just betrays a deep misunderstanding of how these technologies work. And so when they're making recommendations about how to manage these technologies, they're completely missing the mark. Now let me talk about the other side of the coin. Just as that there are ethicists and policymakers and people who understand the normative side of things, but they're insufficiently attentive to the technologies, there are lots and lots of technologists and practitioners that are insufficiently attentive to the foundations of ethics and don't understand how ethics and policymaking work. So let me work through a case in fairness in AI, but this lesson also applies just as easily to transparency and privacy, and I'm happy to talk through those if people have questions about them. So one of the challenges we face in leveraging algorithms and decision-making is that they inherit the biases of their training data. And indeed, we see many examples of this. Perhaps the most common example, though I think things are more nuanced than the public discussion has suggested, is Compass. Compass is an algorithm that was used to predict recidivism. So it was used to assign risk scores to people who were being evaluated for pretrial detention. But it was designed to develop risk scores, and the risk score was supposed to correlate to the chance of reoffense of a crime. It was then used to determine whether people should be held for pretrial detention or not. Now, the problem is, well, it will not surprise you to find out that Compass mistakenly labeled Black defendants as having a higher risk of reoffense than otherwise what seemed like similar cases for white defendants. Another example where we have a fairness problem is Amazon spent a ton of money, well, a ton by my standards, probably nothing by Amazon standards, to develop an algorithmic hiring tool, but they had to shelve it once it was discovered that it was discriminatory against women. We were actually kind of lucky the way we discovered that it was discriminatory against women, because we found that there was a correlate. It was noticing things like playing on going to an all women's college or playing on a women's like a field hockey team was counting against candidates. Because it could have been like this could have gone, if it was picking out more subtle things that weren't so obvious, this might have gone into use. So the problem, these are cases of algorithms that are unfair. The problem of algorithmic fairness is especially worrisome, perhaps because A, people read the outcomes of these systems as objective and often defer to them. So a thing says an individual is high risk, and they just say, okay, they must be high risk. And B, it can be very hard to tell that they're being unfair because they can rely on proxies for race and gender that aren't always recognized as such. So in the Amazon case, we had very obvious proxies going to a women's college, but the proxies can be less obvious. I mean, they can be semi-obvious, like using zip code, which will correspond with race and other characteristics, but they can be much more subtle than that too. And so they can be very hard to detect. So they're, on the one hand, red is objective. On the other hand, invisibly relying on proxies for obviously discriminatory characteristics. So one response to the problem of algorithmic fairness has been develop what are called fairness metrics. These are tools we can use to, they claim, ensure a model meets some metric of fairness or operationalization of fairness. So for example, we can say what we want a model to do is have the same error rates for independent of race. So we want to make sure that the false positive rate for falsely accusing a white individual of being high risk for reoffense is exactly the same for a Black defendant. So we can use these metrics to evaluate the algorithm. We get the same kind of thing in the context of transparency. We try to develop tools for like what it means to say that an algorithm is transparent. I'm going to set this example aside, but happy to come back to it if people want. So why is this solution inadequate? Why is it bad to focus on things like fairness metrics? So I don't think there's something intrinsically bad with developing a kind of fairness metric or a tool for increasing the interpretability of an opaque model. I don't want to say that those are problematic for their own sake or they're just always wrong. But these approaches to addressing algorithmic fairness and opacity are often extremely myopic, or completely free-floating from the things we actually care about from the ethical point of view. They're disconnected from a careful moral evaluation of what we actually owe to people we're making decisions about. There's a tendency, especially in computer science, to see problems of fairness or opacity as technical problems with technical solutions. And for computer scientists, the place in the pathway from data collection to application is where you build and validate the model. So it's unsurprising that there's been a drive to develop these kinds of solutions. Tech companies have been yelled at for being unfair. Tech companies have computer scientists. Computer scientists are going to see where they can intervene, and that's mostly going to be in model building and validation. The other place you see it is in trying to come up with clean data, like make sure the data collection practices are good. But the relevant point is that these aren't purely technical systems. They're socio-technical systems, and the way in which these technologies interact with values is complex. So first, once we take a socio-technical perspective, we should just stop caring about whether models are fair. We care about the fairness of decisions, and we should make sure our model meets some metric. Only it doesn't matter if our model meets some metric of fairness if the decisions it results in are no more fair. So for example, we can imagine that like if judges are going to misapply the data that comes out of the Compass thing, no matter what, if they're going to be biased regardless of what the risk scores are, then what do we care if the thing meets some metric? That just gives us the sort of illusion of fairness when it's not there. Secondly, whether a decision is fair or unfair in the first place is extremely context sensitive. And it's sensitive to not just the context, but the type of fairness we care about. So let me talk about that in the case of Compass. So let's say we've settled on some fairness metric. We've made sure that our model is fair. We make sure the model is fair according to whatever metric anybody prefers. Think about how things change if we think about two different uses of Compass. There's the original Compass use. It's not actually fair to call it the original use because the company didn't say it should be used for this, but what it was actually used for was to determine whether to hold an individual defendant on pretrial detention before trial. That's what it's actually used for. But imagine instead we use it to assess the risk of defendants, and then we use that as a resource allocation tool. So we say, hey, this class of defendants or this defendant is high risk of reoffense. We need to dedicate more resources to keeping them from reoffending, whether that's educational resources, social services, things like that, that lets them go back into their community and be a functioning adult human and minimizes the chance of reoffense. Those are two radical different uses of the same model. Now, here's the fairness thing to point out. You might think it's unfair to Black defendants if they're at a higher risk if they're labeled as higher risk in the first use case, but you might actually think that disproportionately labeling Black defendants as higher risk when it's going to mean more resource allocation to Black communities is exactly what you want. The reason the data is biased is that Black people are over-policed. And so we want to do things that dedicate more resources to Black communities. And so having the bad data, the biased data in there actually lets us make more accurate decisions about where our resource allocation should be to meet the demands of restitutive justice. We owe restitutive justice to certain communities for ways that for the fact that we've generated this bias in the data. And that would be lost if we tried to achieve the fairness metric. And so the kind of questioning we're answering and the kind of fairness we care about is going to determine what kind of what a fair outcome is and what we should care about. And so just focusing at the point of the model is not going to do the trick. Okay, so that's just a quick and dirty overview of some of the mistakes that I just see over and over again in this space. And then the question is, okay, what should we learn from those mistakes? Now, here are some lessons you might draw from these case studies or examples. One, it's important to understand the technologies we're reasoning about. Technical solutions can't be what I call normatively free-floating. We have to actually think about the ethics and not just build a technical solution because we can. We should keep context in mind. We should think about socio-technical systems instead of simply technical systems. Those are okay lessons to draw. They're all, I think, true. I endorse them, but they're not the lessons I want you to draw. It's unreasonable to expect every individual that interacts with these problems to manage the full suite of ethical issues and nuance. Not every humanities faculty can go get a degree in computer science. Not every computer scientist can learn all of ethics. Not every public policy worker or person working at the public sector can learn everything they need to do to advocate for the right kinds of values to solve their specific problem in their specific space. Instead, I think the lesson is that we need what I'm going to call an ethics ecosystem that shapes work in the field in a way that achieves the promise of AI while avoiding the pitfalls. What is an ethics ecosystem? It is a coordinated system of components that distribute the workload of managing ethical issues in a domain or a context. These ecosystems or those parts include ethics infrastructure. That's guidelines and training for practitioners to help them to identify and resolve some ethical issues. It gives them practices and procedures. It gives them checklists. It gives them mechanisms and pathways for escalating issues. Ethics infrastructure also includes oversight and auditing, both human and AI-based auditing. Another component of the ecosystem is outreach, education, and enculturation. We need training in school to equip people in the domain with an understanding of the ethics infrastructure and how to navigate it. We need enculturation to get people in domain to see the world through the lens of the ethics ecosystem. And I'll give an example of this in a minute. We need outreach to others outside the domain so they can more effectively engage with technologies in the domain. Like we need outreach to the public so they know enough about these technologies to be good advocates for themselves. We need what I'm going to call translational research programs. There are just foundational ethical issues that need to be resolved, and that's true for policy issues too. And we need to do research in that space. There's no off-the-shelf solution. We need to come up with new solutions and then translate the core research out to the ethics ecosystem to actually put it into practice. We need interdisciplinary practices. It needs to be the default that there's interdisciplinary engagement and broad stakeholder engagement between computer scientists, practitioners, the public, ethicists, social scientists, to think about these problems to avoid all the blind spots that we have. We need informed policy and regulations. We need politicians and regulators that understand the details of the technology and can craft useful regulation that actually provides guidance and puts some teeth behind it. And I think at the core of an ethics ecosystem, what other ethics ecosystems really have that facilitates all this is a sort of common language and a set of interdisciplinary practitioners or transdisciplinary practitioners. In other areas, when we talk about ethical concerns, we have sort of standard pieces of language that we use, like informed consent, which captures something very specific. And we can use that to talk across different areas. And everyone sort of knows they're talking about the same thing, instead of every meeting I go to when someone talks to me about fair AI, we have to spend an hour or two just making sure we mean the same thing by what fairness is. So when we think about where we are with respect to AI, I think it's very instructive to think about how it compares to biomedical ethics. And that biomedical ethics itself has three robust ethics ecosystems: one for clinical care, like patients in hospitals; one for human subject research, where we're doing research, which has different ethical demands; and then animal subject research. Each of these is crushing it compared to AI ethics. Biomedical ethics has long-standing guidelines for practitioners. Doctors and medical researchers receive relatively unified training and rules to follow. They are entrenched in the practice of medicine, those rules. There's concrete oversight infrastructure, like before I mentioned the IRB. That varies, of course, country to country, but there's some form of oversight for both human and animal research. And they work to sort of not only reinforce the norms, but ensure compliance with the norms, help satisfy certain guidelines, review research before it starts, for example. There are accountability frameworks. Those IRBs and oversight committees have real power to monitor and intervene. They have tools for auditing compliance with norms. They have regular reviews to ensure, for example, that the ethics infrastructure is living up to its responsibilities. Bioethics also has a robust research infrastructure. There are conferences to share work and the latest research. There are robust collections of case studies, training materials. Because of all that, participants in biomedical researchers in biomedical ethics speak a common language. They can easily communicate concerns and justifications to one another. Finally, there's a group of people that are trained intermediaries between ethics and medicine and health research. Those are called bioethicists. Bioethicists are not philosophical ethicists like me. They aren't doctors. They aren't lawyers. I mean, maybe they're one of those. Maybe that's where they started, but it's its own specialty, focused on drawing on and deploying the resources of the ecosystem to help solve ethical challenges in that space. If we contrast that with AI ethics, we don't have specific guidelines for practitioners. That's why this seminar exists, I assume. There's no concrete, robust oversight infrastructure. There's no well-developed accountability frameworks. There are growing research programs and information exchange, but there are still deep disconnects between key participants in the work. AI ethics specialists and industry partners are not in very close contact with one another. Only the most, I was going to say like the like wealthiest companies, but it's really the companies that are under most PR scrutiny have dedicated AI ethics teams. Technical practitioners and ethical experts do not speak a common language. Like I said, when I talk about fairness with my colleagues, especially in computer science, there's a lot of calibration that has to happen between us. There's no equivalent to the biomedical ethicist, at least not as a profession. There are some individuals that serve that sort of role. I have a lot of colleagues that we hire in to try to do that work, but not in a way that provides a nearly enough capacity to handle all the work that needs to be done. Now, I don't want to overstate things. The systemic capacity in medical ethics and research ethics isn't perfect. And I'm sure there's an ethics ecosystem that is part of your profession in some way. I mean, I'm sure it's not perfect and you also have complaints. But I have two things to say. So in the not so distant past, there were just significant failures to live up to the standard of ethics in medicine and medical research. So it's not like it's been perfect forever. And there are many ways that I think bioethics can improve. But I do want to say that the best criticisms of those ecosystems come from the ecosystems. People that grew up in them, understand them, are trained to evaluate them, provide good reasons to move them forward. So we have lots of criticisms of the current lack of ethics ecosystem, but don't have the sort of infrastructure to help move us further along. I want to close with, just checking my time. Looks like we're doing okay. I want to close by going through an example where I've done some work to try to build an ethics ecosystem or contribute to an ethics ecosystem for a very, let's call it a mini ecosystem, because it's a very, very small problem in the space, a relatively small problem in the space. So I'm part of a project called the National Internet Observatory. What the National Internet Observatory is an infrastructure project where what we're trying to do is the following. Currently, if you want to research how platforms influence internet users' behavior or how internet users engage with the internet, you have to rely on data from the platform directly. You have to either create a scraper or an API. Maybe you've seen some of this in the news about companies shutting down their API. Researchers are freaking out about this, for example, because Twitter was one of the ways we tracked information, misinformation, was by using the API for Twitter, which let us track what people were tweeting. And that access became very expensive. So researchers no longer have access to that. Furthermore, the data is often structured in databases that are organized towards helping companies make profit, not do academic research on how misinformation flows. What NEO is a project that tries to collect data from users, clean that data, and then give researchers, academic researchers, access to that data so they can more easily see how internet platforms interact with users, how information flows and things like that. So we've created a set of tools. People consent to our tools. They install them. It lets us track a lot of what they're doing on the web and create an anonymized database. Now, I'm the co-lead of the ethics component of NEO, and we were tasked with building up an ethics toolkit that we could manage the issues that are not covered by traditional IRB oversight. So an IRB is going to oversee anytime we try to pull in participants to give us their data. But once we collect the data, any research that people from the outside come do on that data does not count as human subject research and is not subject to regulation and oversight. But we think that can have broad social effects. So we've been working to build a system that helps us manage protecting a bunch of values for our core stakeholders, for a lot of stakeholders. So here's just a map of sort of the timeline of the project and when stakeholders become relevant. So at the beginning, there's the people we want to recruit, and then us, the research team. And then eventually we're going to recruit some direct data participants, the people who are going to give us their data. They're going to take surveys. They're going to use our mobile app. They're going to use our browser. But there are also indirect data subjects, people who might use the computer of someone that's agreed to come into our study, and they're contributing data maybe unknowingly. Once we've collected all the data and we're going to start making it available to researchers, we get new stakeholders. There's the researchers themselves that want to come use our data, but they're going to be able to make inferences about people who are not in our study. They're going to use our study data to make inferences more broadly. And those can have broad social impacts, both for those inference subjects, but also for citizens, policymakers. Who knows what the research is going to generate in terms of like what kind of policy recommendations come out. It could have broad social impacts on citizens depending on what research get published. It also impacts the research communities. If Facebook decides, for example, that they don't like that NEO exists, I'm not supposed to call it Facebook anymore. If Meta decides that they don't like that NEO exists or we're causing trouble for them, they might make it harder for researchers like us and other researchers to access the data. So we have to think about a broad range of stakeholders and how to manage the ethical issues that arise in this context. So we sort of just have gone through the process that IRBs did. We started with what are our core ends? And we settled on a small set. We want to minimize privacy risks. We want to enable scientifically and socially responsible use of this data. We want to enable and ensure compliance. We want to make sure that when our researchers come and they're saying they're doing something and we approve it, we say, yes, you can do that, that they're actually doing it, that they're living up to the norms that we set, which are which are more than just the norms set by their research institution. We want to enable transparency, and we want to protect and promote participant autonomy. Now, once we had that, we sort of started like, okay, what's the sole suite of tools that we need to develop, and how do we get to that suite of tools to achieve those ends? And we have a sort of tripartite approach. One of the core elements of our approach is a value integrated design or embedded ethics approach. Our whole team meets regularly. Like the ethicists are in the room when the programmers are deciding what they're going to program things to do, and we're asking them to translate it into language we can understand. And they come to our ethics meetings. I feel so bad for them. And they listen to us talk about ethical issues, and then they ask us how do we translate what we're saying into something they can actually put in the code. We try as much as possible to draw on existing analogs, models, and disciplinary insights. There is really good research out there on ethics of AI and data ethics. It hasn't yet been incorporated in an ethics ecosystem, but there is stuff to draw on. There's also examples outside of data ethics where you can get useful insights as long as you're careful to craft them to your own ecosystem. I'll talk about one example of that. And we also have a really broad ethics advisory board because we know things are likely to fall through the cracks in our team. So just quickly, an ethics advisory board that consists of bioethicists, data ethicists, media studies people, lawyers, one philosopher plus me, covering all different areas in the hopes that we just recognize these are interdisciplinary problems, and we can't just have bioethicists in the room or data ethicists in the room. We need people from every discipline in order to hear things that we might not otherwise catch through our own disciplinary ears. We also, there's lots of like I mentioned, there's lots of analogs, models, and insights. One thing we've really drawn on is, interestingly, in this bioethics space, genomics research raises a lot of the same kinds of problems as big data analytics research, because knowing someone's genome lets you infer things about people that are related to them, even though they didn't consent. And so there's this big project called All of Us, which is about collecting the genome of many people in the US so you can facilitate precision medicine research. And they've had to try to work through these things from the ground up too, because they recognize that standard protocols are not protective enough. So we've been trying to draw on those too. I'm not happy to talk about any of those details. But we used all this to develop a toolkit. There's a publication, you can find it on, it's open source at nature.com, where we sort of said like, hey, here's our core ends. There's actually 2 pages of this diagram that lists out, here are all the individual tools that you need to try to achieve these core ends across. We have what we call the Swiss cheese model, which is we don't think there's any one intervention that's going to solve a problem. Things are always going to fall through the cracks, and you just hope there's another layer below, or you try to make it so there's another layer below that catches that problem. That's all just to say, I don't expect all of you to build such an ecosystem, but there's one way to think about the problem is like, give me this set of tools or the set of guidelines that help me solve this problem. And the other is thinking ecosystemically about how do you build the whole system of components necessary to actually think about these problems. How do we enable people at the front line to know when to call for help and who to call for help and what a solution looks like? So I'll stop there and open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Let me just stop the recording.